I only needed shelter. But that old Mallet knew my family's secret.
No coat worth pawning, no room to return to, no photograph of her mother, just $3 in her hem that her father had hidden years before, and with that money she bought a forgotten wooden croquet-set maker's shop outside South Paris, Oxford County, Maine. Absent from county maps since 1968, the north sill had split beneath the corner post. Half the roof sagged toward a dead chimney. Oxford County condemned it on October 14, 2022, with demolition planned for the following spring. Yet inside one massive lignum-vitae mallet head, sealed behind a cedar disc and brass bands for 57 years, waited a cache meant to alter the shape of her life. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. June Eleanor Bell had been measuring her whole life without knowing it. As a child, she measured mornings by steam on the kitchen window, winters by snow against the porch steps, and her father's tiredness by how long he stood before opening the refrigerator. Her mother had died when June was 6, leaving a blue sewing tin, a wool scarf, and a smell of ivory soap that returned when rain struck warm pavement. Her father, Samuel Bell, repaired school buses and carried wood shavings in his cuffs from private work done after supper. He spoke little about grief. Instead, he taught June to sharpen a pencil with a pocket knife, square a shelf by checking both diagonals, and keep every useful screw in a jar. The fuller education came from Samuel's father, Alden Bell, who lived beyond Norway Lake with a woodshop attached to his house. Every Saturday, Samuel left June there before sunrise. Alden turned chair spindles, tool handles, and once a complete croquet set from hard maple felled by lightning. June stood on an apple crate beside the belt-driven lathe while he showed her how to listen before touching steel to wood. A true running blank gave a low, even hum. A crooked one clicked once per turn. He let her sweep shavings into a bushel basket, then choose one scrap from the stove pile to practice on. By 12, she could set a gouge against the tool rest without catching an edge. By 14, she could turn a ball nearly round enough to satisfy him. A mallet reveals the grain it survives, Alden told her. He meant wood, but June understood that he also meant people. Hardness alone was not strength. The grain had to run true through the center. Alden died in March of her 17th year, 2 days after a stroke took his speech. His shop was sold before June finished school. The lathe went to a dealer in Auburn, the pattern books disappeared into an estate lot, and the old croquet set was divided among strangers. Samuel promised to find the blue sewing tin and Alden's brass calipers. He never did. By then, Samuel had married Corinne Voss, a woman whose room smelled of lemon wax and whose silence could rearrange a household. She labeled pantry shelves, kept the thermostat at 62, and removed objects that did not match. June's mother's scarf vanished first, then Alden's carving knife. Corinne never raised her voice. She narrowed choices until obedience appeared voluntary. Samuel died on September 3, 2022, in a hospital room where the blinds would not close evenly. 11 days later, Corinne placed June's canvas duffel beside the front door. On top lay the blue sewing tin, empty except for one bent pin. "You have no claim hereafter today, June." Exactly 8 words. June looked toward the hallway cabinet where Samuel had kept the family papers. Corinne rested one palm against its locked door. On the dining table sat a probate envelope and an uncapped pen. June's Aunt Miriam stood at the sink holding a dry plate beneath running water. She did not turn around. That was the betrayal June remembered, water pouring over clean china while someone chose not to see. June lifted the duffel. At the curb she opened the sewing tin and found 3 $1 bills stitched beneath its felt lining. Samuel's handwriting on the top bill read, "For the road home." For 6 weeks there was no road home. She slept beneath the loading platform behind the Lewiston bus depot, where concrete held cold through cardboard. In Auburn, she spent 4 nights in a church basement until the cots filled. In Brunswick, she washed in the library restroom and slept behind a laundromat vent that breathed warm lint until dawn. Her money fell from $3 to $2.75 after tea. then to 189 after bread and peanut butter, then stopped falling because she would not break the last bills. She walked with newspaper under her sweater and learned which benches were watched, which stores discarded bruised apples, and which officers asked questions without waiting for answers. By late October, she had reached Portland. One rainy afternoon, she entered the Maine library to dry her socks beneath a restroom hand dryer. On the second floor, beside old tax maps, a local weekly lay open to classified notices. A 3-line advertisement had been boxed in blue pencil abandoned wood-turning shop. South Paris outskirts, tax deed transfer, $3. Buyer assumes all liabilities. June read it twice. Then she copied the clerk's address onto the back of a checkout slip. The price looked less like chance than measurement, the exact sum still sewn inside the tin. She left Portland before dark, carrying no plan beyond northbound roads, the library slip, and the knowledge that $3 could purchase either one poor meal or a door no one else wanted. By dawn, June was walking toward South Paris, where a condemned shop waited behind walnut trees with broken machinery and one mallet too heavy for its size. The northbound bus carried June as far as Gray, where the driver lowered her duffel onto wet gravel and pointed toward Route 26 with 2 fingers. South Paris is better than 30 miles. She thanked him and began walking. The rain held off until evening, though the clouds hung close enough to darken the pine trunks. She covered 19 miles before her left heel opened beneath the sock. Near Poland Corner, she found a hay barn with one door hanging loose and slept between square bales that smelled of clover, mouse nests, and summer dust. The temperature fell to 29 degrees. June tucked the empty sewing tin beneath her ribs, wrapped her feet in pages torn from an abandoned farm circular, and woke whenever the boards snapped in the cold. She walked again before sunrise, eating half an apple left beside a roadside mailbox. By the second afternoon, hills had replaced the low country, and the shoulders narrowed beneath yellow birches. A logging truck passed so close that its wake pressed her coat against her back. She reached South Paris with 13 cents, a blood-stiffened sock, and enough daylight to see the town before the lamps came on. Market Square held a practical row of businesses. Lurvy's pharmacy with green glass jars in the window, Crockett's hardware under a galvanized awning, Doris May's cafe smelling of onions and coffee, the Oxford County Savings Bank with granite steps, and a narrow barber shop where a striped pole turned without sound. Across the square, the courthouse clock read 4:17. The county clerk's office occupied the rear of a brick municipal building whose radiators knocked like trapped pipes. June entered through a door marked Tax-Acquired Property and stood on linoleum worn pale along the center. Behind the counter, a woman with a silver braid thick as rope was pressing documents beneath a blotter. Her nameplate read Mrs. Evelyn Foss, Deputy Clerk. Mrs. Foss looked first at June's wet shoes, then at the duffel, and finally at the 3 bills laid carefully on the counter. You came for the Bell property. The wood-turning shop. Mrs. Foss removed her spectacles and cleaned one lens with the corner of her cardigan. You understand the roof may fail under snow. Yes, ma'am. You understand there is no inspected well. Yes, ma'am. You understand the county will not provide heat, access, repairs, or removal of debris. Yes, ma'am. You understand that taking title cancels demolition, but every injury and every dollar afterward belongs to you. Yes, ma'am. The clerk replaced her spectacles. How old are you? 20. That was not one of the warnings. No, ma'am. Mrs. Foss studied her for several breaths, then unlocked a lower drawer. She brought out a deed, 2 carbon sheets, and a small brass stamp with a black walnut handle. June signed where the clerk placed an X. Her name looked too thin for land ownership. The stamp came down once, deliberate and heavy. Its brass face left the Oxford County seal impressed through all 3 sheets. Mrs. Foss counted the dollars, folded them into a receipt book, and described the route. Take High Street west, past the fairgrounds, turn on to the old county road where the pavement ends. You will cross a narrow bridge over Stony Brook. The shop is another 1.25 miles on the north side behind a stand of walnut trees. The marker says Bell Sporting Goods, though you may have to move vines to read it. June's hand stopped over the receipt. Bell? Mrs. Foss looked at the deed again. Your surname is Bell. Yes. Any relation to Alden Bell of Norway? June gripped the counter edge. "He was my grandfather." The clerk sat back. One hand rose to the silver braid, not touching it. "Alden used to come here with Walter Bell, the last owner of that shop. They were cousins, perhaps second cousins. I was a girl then. Walter ordered county maps through my father and paid in wooden balls he had turned too small for regulation play." June said nothing. Mrs. Foss opened an old index ledger whose pages had browned around the edges. She found a line with one fingernail. "Walter Bell, proprietor. Samuel Bell, witness to transfer of equipment, 1981. Samuel, her father, had been 21 that year. He knew about the shop, June said. It appears he did. Mrs. Foss turned the ledger so June could see the signature. The capital S leaned forward exactly as it had on the dollar bill in the sewing tin. Below it, the ink had feathered into the paper. Why did the county sell it for $3? Because $1 was the minimum deed price when Walter acquired it. And because he wrote into the file that no Bell should pay more than the original transfer amount. Mrs. Foss closed the book. The taxes were waived after abandonment. Nobody challenged the condition because nobody wanted the liabilities. She pushed the original deed across the counter in a brown envelope. At the door, June looked back. Mrs. Foss had taken the 3 $1 bills from the receipt book. 2 went into the cash drawer. The third, the one bearing Samuel's message, she held beneath the desk lamp. "You ought to keep that one," June said. "It belongs to the county now, then keep it somewhere careful." Mrs. Foss slid it beneath the glass top of her desk. Outside, the rain had thinned into mist. June passed the fairgrounds where empty livestock sheds stood in rows and a torn banner struck a pole. The pavement ended beyond a white farmhouse. A man in a red wool cap was stacking split ash beside his mailbox while a black dog watched from beneath the cart. "You headed to the Bell place?" he called. June nodded. The dog came forward without barking and smelled the duffel. "Name's Amos Reed. That's Mercy. She dislikes engines and liars." Mercy sat on June's boot. Amos pointed down the road. "Bridges sound near the middle. Keep left at the washout." Walnut trees began beyond the brook, their bare limbs holding nests like dark knots. The road climbed and narrowed. June saw the chimney first, a blunt stone column leaning above the branches, then a strip of roof and the faded angle of a wooden sign. The building stood longer than she expected, nearly 40 feet from front wall to rear shed, but no more than 18 feet wide. Its clapboards had weathered from white to iron gray. The foundation was fieldstone, the roof cedar shingle beneath later patches of rusted tin, and the chimney rose from the western wall with 2 courses missing at the crown. Over the double doors only 4 letters remained clear beneath moss. Bell. June loosened the chain with the county key. The doors opened 3 inches before dragging against the floor. Dry paint met her first, bitter and mineral, followed by the sweet rot of maple shavings. She pressed her shoulder to the wood. Something small fled beneath a cabinet. Rust tasted in the air when she breathed through her mouth. The front room held a counter, a cast-iron stove, and shelves bowed under wooden balls dulled to brown, green, and faded red. One rolled when the door moved and crossed the dirt-streaked floor with a hollow, wandering sound. June caught it beneath her palm. Its enamel had cracked into islands. In the back room, evening entered through broken panes and lay across a belt-driven lathe whose leather drive strap had fallen in loops. Maple mallet heads rested in a bin beside handles warped like drawn bows. A rack of gouges stood above the bench, their steel orange with rust. When June touched the largest lathe wheel, it moved half a turn and stopped with a dry complaint. She found the well behind the shop, capped with a board and stone, and an outhouse leaning toward the creek. There was no food, no blanket, and no sound from the road. She swept one corner of the front room with a bundle of birch twigs, spread newspaper beneath her, and used the duffel as a pillow. The floor smelled of cold earth. Somewhere inside the wall, a beetle clicked with exact intervals. Wind entered through the cracked window and stirred the county deed against her chest. Before sleep, June placed the worn croquet ball beside the sewing tin. In the game of life, many mallet blows will fall, but a strong core rolls forward instead of breaking. June woke before daylight to the sound of water dropping somewhere beneath the floor. For the first 3 days, she treated the shop as a machine whose workings had to be learned before they could be trusted. The well rope had rotted through, so she tied the county deed envelope around her wrist, lowered a dented paint can on sash cord, and drew water that smelled faintly of iron. She boiled it in an enamel pot found beneath the counter. The outhouse door would not close until she shaved the swollen edge with a rusted plane iron. By the third night, she knew which floorboard complained beside the stove, which one clicked near the lathe, and which long plank remained silent beneath her weight. On the fourth morning, she walked back into town. Crockett's hardware was deeper than its narrow front suggested, with bins of square nails, stovepipe elbows hanging from rafters, and the mixed smell of kerosene, rope, and oiled steel. A brass bell above the door gave one dull note. Behind the counter stood a broad man whose left eyebrow was white while the right remained black. "Elias Crockett," he said, "you are the Bell girl. June Bell. I heard the deed stamp from here." She placed 13 cents on the counter and asked the price of a chimney brush. Elias looked at the coins, then at the heel of her boot where cardboard showed through the leather. He brought out a ruled account book. "I do not extend credit to strangers." June nodded and began gathering her coins. "But I know the property," he continued, "and I knew Alden. Write your name here. Pay when you can. No interest unless you become dishonest," she signed. Elias added a thin green book with a torn cover. "Practical Repairs for Rural Buildings, 1947. That one is free because nobody has opened it since Eisenhower." She bought only what the shop required first. A 6-inch wired chimney brush for $3.40, 40 feet of jointed fiberglass rod for $4.80, a pound of washing soda for 28 cents, a stovepipe damper for 75 cents, and 2 feet of galvanized flashing for 60 cents. Elias added a pair of leather gloves with a burned thumb. "They belong to my brother. The right one still works." Back at the shop, June moved the stove outside on 2 maple rollers and disconnected the pipe one section at a time. Soot fell from the elbows in soft black folds. She spread feed sacks across the floor, sealed the firebox opening with damp rags, and climbed to the roof by setting a ladder against the soundest section of eave. The chimney crown crumbled beneath her glove. She tied the brush rod to her wrist, lowered the wire head 6 feet, and worked it with short strokes until the bristles scraped all 4 walls. Then she added another rod. Creosote came down in brittle scales, some glossy as coal, some thick enough to bend before snapping. Twice, the brush lodged at a narrowing in the flue. June rotated the rod clockwise, withdrew it 3 inches, and drove it down again. By noon, her hair and eyelashes were gray with ash. By dusk, she had filled half a flour sack. The next morning, she scrubbed the stove body with washing soda and hot water, patched 1 pinhole with furnace cement. Elias had spooned into a paper cup and reset the stovepipe with the crimped ends pointing downward so condensation would remain inside the pipe. The new damper turned without binding. The work took 11 hours over 2 days. For the test, she placed 3 twists of newspaper beneath dry cedar splints, then laid 2 narrow maple pieces across them with air between. She opened the damper, warmed the flue by holding a burning paper roll near the throat, and watched the smoke rise rather than spill. The fire caught quietly. Heat moved through the iron in widening circles. June held both hands near the stove until the stiffness left her fingers. She boiled water, stirred cornmeal into it with salt, and ate from the pot while sitting on the floor. It was the first hot meal she had cooked for herself since September. Afterward, she entered the back room with the green repair book beneath her arm and began a proper inventory. She kept only what could teach her something. There were 3 spindle gouges wrapped in newspaper, their handles dark with use, a maple sizing gauge marked with circles from 2 3/4 to 3 5/8 inches, a steel caliper whose hinge opened smoothly despite rust, 4 cans of hardened enamel with narrow stripes painted across their lids, a hand drill fitted with a long spoon bit, a box of horn glue cakes brittle as amber, and beneath the bench a rack holding 12 unfinished mallet heads. Most were maple. The last was not. It lay behind the others, almost 30 inches long, bound at both ends with tarnished brass. The wood was green-black beneath the grime and dense enough that June first mistook it for stained iron. 2 handles would have been needed to use it as a mallet, yet there was only one socket bored through its center. She tried to lift it with one hand. The head barely moved. June set the steel caliper beside it, measured the diameter, and compared its size with the maple blanks. Ahead, that volume should not have weighed more than 12 pounds. This one weighed nearly twice that by her estimate. She rolled it across the bench. The maple heads gave a clear wooden note when tapped with a gouge handle. The dark head answered differently. One end rang solid. The center gave a flat knock. Near the opposite brass band, the sound became hollow for less than 3 inches, then solid again. June tapped the same path twice more. The pattern remained exact. She cleaned the brass with oil and a square of wool. No screws appeared. The bands had been shrunk onto the wood, heated, and driven in place. At one end, however, the grain formed a circle too perfect to be natural. She held the lamp near it and saw a narrow seam beneath old wax, a cedar disc. The repair manual offered no instruction for opening a sealed mallet head, but Alden had once shown her how cabinet makers removed wooden plugs without crushing their edges. She warmed the end beside the stove, not enough to scorch it, only until the wax softened. Then she pressed the spoon bit into the disc by hand and turned it half a revolution. The cedar moved. June stopped. She cleared the bench, washed her hands, and placed a folded feed sack beneath the head. With a narrow awl, she worked around the disc one fraction at a time. The wax released with a dry whisper. When the plug came free, the hollow inside breathed out cedar, metal, and the stale sweetness of old paper. The first package was wrapped in oilcloth and tied with linen thread. June drew it out by the knot and laid it flat. Inside rested a small turning chisel with a horn handle, a pair of spring calipers, and a hardened steel template pierced with 5 graduated circles. Each tool bore the same stamped mark. A croquet wicket crossed by a turning gouge. The second bundle contained 6 squares of lignum-vitae, each cut from heartwood and labeled in faded pencil by weight and year. Beneath them lay a thumb-sized ivory croquet ball, perfectly round, its surface yellowed but uncracked. The third object was a tin box that had been fitted so closely into the hollow that June had to hook it with bent wire. Its lid was sealed with red wax. She carried the box into the front room and set it beside the stove. Outside, dusk settled over the walnut trees. Inside, the fire shifted and dropped one coal against the grate. June broke the wax with the back of Alden's old-style caliper. The lid opened on folded currency, paper rolls of coins, a narrow formula booklet, and an envelope bearing no name. She did not touch the envelope. She counted the money first because numbers could be verified. There were bundles of 20s tied with cotton tape, packets of $10 silver certificates, and smaller notes folded around coin rolls. She counted once, then again in reverse order. The coins included Morgan silver dollars, Walking Liberty half-dollars, Mercury dimes, and Indian head cents packed in paper blackened at the folds. At the bottom lay a bronze star medal in a cloth pouch engraved on the reverse. Thomas W. Bell 1945 June arranged every bundle in rows upon the floor. She wrote each subtotal in the margin of the repair book, checked the arithmetic, and began again after finding 1 dime inside a torn wrapper. The exact total was $23,600. She sat with her knees drawn up and listened to the fire. The formula booklet was smaller than her palm. Its first pages held measurements for turning maple balls that would resist denting. Stock dried to 8% moisture. Grain centered before roughing. A final diameter allowance of 1/32 inch and enamel cured in low heat before the last polish. The later pages were written in a different hand. The envelope remained closed. June placed the money back in the tin box, leaving the metal and ivory ball on the feed sack. She pushed the cedar disc loosely into the mallet head, covered the bench with canvas, and carried the envelope outside without reading it. A stony brook had risen after the rain. Water moved around stones in black folds, carrying leaves beneath the narrow bridge. June stood at the bank until her breath showed white and the shop windows behind her became 2 dim squares among the trees. She had entered the building with 13 cents and a deed no one wanted. Now a sealed letter rested in both hands, heavier than the tin box had felt. She waited until the moon cleared the branches, then returned to the shop and placed the envelope beside the unlit lamp. In the game of life, many mallet blows will fall, but a strong core rolls forward instead of breaking. At first light, June fed 2 maple sticks into the stove and set the envelope beneath the window. The paper had gone cream-colored around its edges. On the front, 3 words leaned slightly forward in dark blue ink. To the finder. June knew the hand before she opened it. The capital T had the same long crossbar Alden used on birthday cards and labels tied to drying lumber. She slid a knife beneath the flap. "My dear one, whoever you are, if you have opened the lignum-vitae head without splitting the cedar plug, then you possess either patience or instruction. Both are worth more than speed. My name is Alden Samuel Bell. I am writing from a rented room on Congress Street in Portland, Maine, where Dr. Miriam Cole has told me that the weakness in my hands is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. She says the disease will take the muscles first and leave the hearing until late. I have begun this letter while I can still hold a pen. The shop you stand in began with Josiah Bell, born in Bethel in 1834. He learned spindle turning at Mechanic Falls and opened this building in 1869. His daughter, Ruth Bell Mercer, born in 1878, painted the stripes and kept the order ledger after her husband was killed in France during the First World War. Her son, Walter Mercer Bell, born in South Paris in 1901, changed the foot-powered lathes to belt drive and shipped lawn sets as far as Ohio. Walter taught me Alden Bell, born in Norway in 1937, though the shop had already grown quiet by then. The trade closed on November 12, 1968. That afternoon, Walter swept the turning room, drained the glue pot, and covered the lathe with canvas. No customer entered afterward. More than 30 years passed in silence before I returned with your father, Samuel, to seal these things away. Samuel was young and angry that day. He believed a man should not preserve a failed shop. I told him failure was not always the proper measure. A tool may wait longer than its maker. The money in the box came from the last accounts, the sale of 2 timber lots, and wages I kept after my brother Thomas did not return from the Second World War. The Bronze Star belonged to him. It should be kept with respect, not displayed for pride. The small ivory ball was Ruth's gauge piece. Do not use it for play. If you turn hard maple, dry the blank until it holds between 7 and 9% moisture. Rough the ball 1/16 inch large, then let it rest 48 hours before the final cut. Mix 1 part hide glue with 2 parts cold water and allow it to swell overnight before heating it below 140 degrees. For enamel stripes, cure each coat at 110 degrees for 6 hours, then wait a full day before polishing. Never chase perfect roundness by eye. Measure across the grain, turn the piece, and measure again. The formula book contains what Walter learned about balls that roll true without bruising. The numbers are useful, but they are not the inheritance. The inheritance is the habit of exact work when no one is watching. It is cleaning the edge before putting the chisel away. It is refusing rotten stock even when winter is close. It is making an object strong enough to outlast the hand that formed it. Use the money to make the building sound. Spend slowly. Keep an account. Leave something behind for the next person who arrives with less than they need. I do not know whether that person will carry our name. Blood has never been the only way a craft continues. Behind the shop, near the brook, stands a fieldstone marker set flat beneath the oldest walnut. Ruth carved the family mark into its face. Clear the moss and you will know you have found it. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. Alden Samuel Bell, April 19, 2001 June reached the signature and began again from the first line. The second reading was slower. She stopped once at Samuel's name and pressed the paper flat where her thumb had bent it. When she finished, she folded the letter along its original creases, neither adding a fold nor smoothing away the old ones, and returned it to the envelope. She took the ivory ball and the formula booklet through the back door. The morning had hardened the mud around the well. Near Stony Brook, the oldest walnut grew with one root exposed above the bank like a bent knee. June cleared wet leaves from beneath it, then scraped away moss with the edge of a cedar shingle. A fieldstone lay level with the ground. Its carved mark showed a narrow croquet wicket crossed by a turning gouge, the same symbol stamped into the heirloom tools. One side had sunk beneath the root. June did not try to lift it. She set the ivory ball at the center of the mark for a moment, then placed it back in her pocket. Inside the shop, she chose one object from the sealed mallet, the horn-handled turning chisel. She rubbed its steel with oil until the rust stains thinned, sharpened the bevel on a small stone, and held the edge near the lamp. Then she lit the wick and turned the tool beneath the flame. The polished line caught the light. It was not restored, but it could work again. At noon, Mrs. Foss came along the road carrying a parcel wrapped in courthouse paper. Inside were wool socks and a copy of the deed sealed against damp. She placed them on the counter without mentioning the dollar beneath her desk glass. Before dusk, Elias Crockett left a covered jar of bean soup beside the stove and pretended he had come only to inspect the damper. Amos Reed brought a dry armload of ash in his cart while Mercy sat at the door, refusing to enter until June invited her. The bus driver from Gray had given directions without contempt. The woman in the Brunswick church basement had once saved June the corner cot nearest the radiator. None of them had changed her life in one grand gesture. Each had moved one small weight from her path. Before this story goes on, think of one small kindness someone once gave you when they had no reason to help. Tell us in the comments what they did, and, if you can, carry that same kindness to another person who may be standing at the edge of a difficult road. That night, June wrapped Alden's letter in oilcloth and placed it inside the empty sewing tin. She slept near the stove with the formula booklet, the medal, the ivory ball, and the cleaned chisel arranged beside her, close enough to touch without rising. The first snow came on December 3rd, laying 7 inches over the walnut roots and filling the wheel ruts along the county road. June read the roofing chapter in Elias's green repair manual 3 times. The first reading told her what the words meant. The second showed her how one mistake could enter beneath another. On the third, she copied the measurements into the account book. The main roof was 38 feet long, with 2 slopes measuring 11 feet from ridge to eave. Allowing for waste and overlap, she calculated 9 squares of cedar shingles, 4 rolls of 30-pound felt, and 22 pounds of hot-dipped nails. The cost would consume more than she wished to remove from the tin box, but a leaking roof would consume everything beneath it. Elias delivered the materials in a truck that coughed blue smoke. From behind the seat, he brought out a roofing hatchet with a notched blade and a leather grip polished nearly black. My brother Martin used this until his knees quit. June accepted it with both hands. The skilled help arrived the next morning without being asked. Harlan Pike, a retired roofer of 74, stood beneath the eave wearing canvas trousers and a cap stiff with old tar. His right index finger ended at the first knuckle. He examined the sagging corner, spat into the snow, and said he would not take payment from someone trying to save honest lumber. They worked for 11 days. Harlan showed June how to brace the damaged section before removing the rotten sheathing. They raised a sister rafter beside the cracked original, drew both members together with clamps, and fastened them without forcing the old roof line perfectly straight. A building that age, he said, had earned certain departures from level. June snapped chalk lines across the felt and learned to seat each shingle with a 3-stroke rhythm. 1 light tap to place the nail, 1 firm blow to drive it, and 1 final stroke to bring the head flush without crushing the cedar fibers. On the 4th afternoon, Harlan stopped beside her row. That nail's proud. Set it again. June reached for the hatchet. Pull it. The split will travel. She eased the nail free, slid a thin shingle scrap beneath the fracture, and drove the replacement 1/2 inch to the side. Snow melted beneath their boots during the warmer hours and froze again before sunset. June carried shingles up the ladder in bundles against her chest. Harlan worked from a roof jack, moving with the small economy of someone whose body remembered danger before his mind named it. They preserved the soundest old shingles for the rear shed and replaced the rusted tin patches with cedar. Along the chimney, June fitted new flashing instep courses, folding each upper piece beneath the shingle above it so water could never meet an upward seam. On December 15th, she drove the final ridge nail. Harlan descended first. From the road, the roof still dipped slightly near the western wall, but its lines were closed, its edges clean, and the fieldstone foundation beneath it remained dry when rain came 2 nights later. January entered through the chimney. The first hard freeze loosened 3 bricks above the roof line. Their faces had begun spalling, shedding thin red scales, while the mortar between them powdered beneath June's thumbnail. She covered the stove, dismantled the upper pipe, and built a working platform from planks resting on roof brackets. Elias advised Portland cement. The green manual warned against it. Modern mortar would be harder than the old brick and hold moisture where freezing could break the masonry apart. June mixed 2 parts wash sand with 1 part hydraulic lime, then added fire clay near the flue in a ratio of 3 parts lime mortar to 1 part clay. She made batches no larger than she could use in 40 minutes. Each failed joint was raked back to solid material, dampened with a brush, and packed from the inner edge outward. For 3 weeks, afternoon temperatures remained in the 20s. June removed her gloves for the final pointing because she could feel the mortar's depth only with bare fingertips. Every 15 minutes her hands went numb. She climbed down, held them near the stove until pain returned, and went back to the scaffold before the mix stiffened. One morning, a brick broke while she was cleaning it. She stood with both halves in her palms, unwilling to discard a piece that had survived more than a century. Harlan, passing on his way to town, showed her how to turn the fracture inward and bed the brick where it would carry no exposed face. The repaired courses cured beneath damp burlap, protected from wind and sudden drying. On January 28th, June built a test fire with cedar splints and 2 lengths of seasoned ash. She warmed the flue, opened the damper, and watched from the yard. The smoke rose clean from the crown, pale and vertical against the winter sky. None leaked through the new joints. Inside, the stove drew without hesitation, and the room lost the sour trace of soot that had lingered since her first night. Late January gave her the floors. Beneath the dirt and spilled enamel lay white pine planks secured with hand-cut rosehead nails. Some boards were worn hollow along the path between the counter and lathe. Others had darkened beneath old oil until their grain could barely be seen. June rented a random orbit sander from Elias for $14 per day. She set every proud nail below the surface with a punch, then began with 80 grit paper, moving slowly enough to avoid shallow waves. The first pass lifted old varnish and decades of blackened wax. The second, at 120 grit, removed the circular marks. The final pass, at 220, left the boards smooth without erasing the small dents made by dropped tools and rolling croquet balls. Dust reached places she had already sealed. It lay across the stove, inside her cuffs, and along the window muntins like pale flour. June vacuumed each joint with a borrowed shop machine, wiped the floor with mineral spirits, and waited overnight before applying the first coat of oil. She rubbed it in with folded cotton following the grain. The pine darkened from dull gray toward deep honey. A second coat brought amber into the knots. After the third, some boards near the lathe appeared almost mahogany where old resin and oil had penetrated them. She allowed 48 hours for the finish to cure and crossed the room only on planks laid above wooden blocks. There was one morning when she did none of it. She had woken before dawn with the account book open beside her and the roof expenses arranged in columns that no longer seemed orderly. Instead of entering the shop, she walked to the marsh beyond Stony Brook. A great blue heron stood in the shallows, its body motionless while the water moved around its legs. June sat beneath an alder for nearly 2 hours. The bird lifted once, crossed the marsh with slow wing beats, and disappeared behind the pines. She returned before dark, swept no dust, mixed no oil, and marked the day honestly in the ledger. No work performed. By February, the windows could no longer be postponed. The shop had 8. 3 held no glass, 4 were cracked, and 1 contained a single original pane whose rippled surface bent the walnut branches into wavering lines. A date, scratched faintly into one corner, read 1788. June removed that sash last and stored it flat between quilts while she repaired the others. She scraped away loose putty with a narrow chisel, softened stubborn sections with low heat, and pulled the old glazing points without twisting the muntins. Rotten corners were consolidated with thin glue rather than cut away. Each replacement pane rested on a narrow bed of DAP 33 glazing putty before June pressed metal points into the wood. The final putty line required more patience than strength. She loaded the knife lightly, drew it from corner to corner in one motion, and angled the bevel so rain would shed beyond the lower edge of the glass. 4 sash cords had broken inside the frames. June opened the weight pockets and drew out cast-iron counterweights furred with dust. She replaced the cord with quarter-inch cotton line, tied a figure-8 knot through each weight eye, and tested the balance before closing the pockets. The repaired sashes rose without jerking and remained wherever she placed them. She preserved the 1788 pane despite its bubbles and the slight diagonal crack. A thin copper support held the fracture without hiding it. On the last afternoon, June seated the upper sash and drew the new cord through its pulley. Outside, a chickadee landed on the nearest walnut branch. The bird tilted its black-capped head as the restored window slid into place. For the first time since June had arrived, every opening in the shop held glass. By late February, the wall beside the chimney had begun dropping pale crumbs onto the new floor. When June removed the loose surface, she found horsehair plaster clinging to hand-split oak lath, each strip uneven and fixed with blackened nails. Her first patch dried too quickly and cracked, the second sagged between the laths, the third pulled loose when the stove warmed the masonry. Elias brought an old feed bag from his barn. A mat of clean horsehair remained in its bottom. June mixed it into lime plaster until the fibers crossed the mortar without clumping. She pressed a scored scratch coat through the gaps in the lath, added a 3/8-inch brown coat after it firmed, and let that layer cure beneath damp cloth for 72 hours. The finish coat went on 1/8-inch thick, drawn smooth with a steel trowel whose corners she had rounded on a stone. The repaired wall did not match the old surface perfectly. June left the slight changes visible. These patches will hold another 100 years. Doris May began leaving paper bags on the doorstep before the plasterwork was finished. Doris owned the cafe in Market Square and wore her gray hair in a net that left one determined curl above her right ear. The first bag contained 2 biscuits, a jar of apple butter, and a heel of ham wrapped in waxed paper. June carried money into town that afternoon. Doris pushed the coins back across the counter with one flour-marked finger. "Pay me in candles when the shop reopens." "I do not make candles. You have time to learn what I meant." After that, the bags appeared twice a week. Doris never knocked. Caleb Reed arrived on a red Schwinn with a splitting maul balanced across the handlebars. He was 15, long-legged, and wore one mitten because the other had been lost to a chain sprocket. Without introducing himself, he split the ash rounds Amos had left beside the shed, stacking each piece bark side up beneath the eave. June offered him 50 cents. He stepped backward as though the coin were hot, my mother said. "About your grandfather." He looked toward the turning room windows, then mounted the bicycle and rode away with the maul across his shoulder. Reverend Boyd passed every morning at 7:10. He was narrow as a fence rail, with silver spectacles and boots polished even in mud. He never entered unless invited. At the walnut trees, he tipped his hat toward the chani. "Keep these hands steady, Lord." 4 words. Then he continued toward town. June had postponed the cellar until February 11th. The hatch stood beneath the rear workbench, pinned by a barrel whose lower hoops had rusted through. She rolled it aside, lifted the door, and waited while the smell of stone, roots, and standing cold entered the room. 7 granite steps descended to a 12 by 15-foot fieldstone floor. The walls sweated where thaw water moved through the earth. At the center lay a dressed granite slab, larger than a tabletop, fitted so closely that only a narrow black line marked its edges. The crossed wicket and gouge had been carved into its face. June brushed the mark clean but did not lift the slab. Something pale showed beneath the 3rd step. She knelt and worked out a small oak box wedged behind the riser. Its lid had swollen shut. After warming it beside the stove, she opened it with the thin blade of a putty knife. Inside lay a brass key. Its bow had been shaped into a croquet wicket, with a tiny turning gouge crossing the center. Beneath it rested a tintype wrapped in cotton. The photograph showed a young woman standing outside the same shop in summer. One window was open behind her, and the walnut tree was little more than a sapling. She wore a dark skirt and held a spindle gouge against one shoulder. Her mouth, brow, and direct gray gaze belonged so closely to June's face that June turned the plate toward the light and then away again. On the back, scratched with a fine point, were the words Ruth Bell, daughter of Josiah, age 25, summer of 1903. June set the tintype beside Alden's letter. The brass key went onto a square nail above the mantel. She tried it in the desk, the cabinets, the lathe drawers, and the old front door lock. It opened nothing. There it remained. March loosened the snow from the roof in long, sliding sheets. Stony Brook grew loud enough to hear from the turning room, and the walnut trees put out tassels of green catkins that shook whenever the wind crossed the water. June sharpened the inherited tools but did not begin making full croquet sets. The formula book was clear, yet her hands had not earned confidence merely because the instructions belonged to her family. She chose 1 mercury dime from the cash and entered its value in the account ledger. With the equivalent sum from her repair money, she purchased hard maple offcuts, fresh hide glue, and 2 ounces of red enamel. She turned small cylinders, test balls, and discarded handles. Some split, some ran out of round. Every failure was dated and kept in a box beneath the bench. The house was patient, so was she. 2 winters later, on December 9, 2024, June fitted a maple blank between the lathe centers and tightened the tailstock until the wood held without bowing. The rebuilt belt traveled evenly over the pulleys. She rough-turned the blank 1/16 inch large, weighing it before placing it on a shelf for 48 hours. When it returned to the lathe, she cut it to the steel template, checking across the grain after every 3 passes. The finished croquet ball was not flawless. One pore near the blue stripe had taken more enamel than the surrounding wood. Its diameter varied by less than 0.004 of an inch. June rolled it along the restored floor. It crossed 30 feet without wandering and touched the far wall with a soft, exact knock. The interior had become sound rather than new. Light passed through 8 repaired windows onto white pine boards the color of dark honey. The lathe stood beneath cleaned line shafting. Gouges hung with their edges turned safely inward. Alden's letter remained in the sewing tin while Ruth's tintype occupied a plain wooden frame near the workbench. Nothing had been polished beyond its usefulness. The brass key waited above the mantel until the first hard frost exposed something June had overlooked. A storm had torn one low limb from the oldest walnut. While trimming the brake, she saw a green edge embedded in the trunk 4 feet above the ground. Bark had grown around a narrow brass plate whose surface bore the crossed wicket and gouge. June fetched the key. It entered the plate without resistance. A quarter turn released a small door cut into an old hollow and disguised beneath living bark. Inside, protected by a tin sleeve, rested a folded 48-star American flag and a note wrapped in oilcloth. The cloth had stiffened, but the paper remained legible. Ruth Bell had written it on October 6, 1918, while influenza spread through Maine and American soldiers remained in France. She wrote that her husband, Edwin Mercer, had died near the Meuse Argonne after repairing a supply wagon under shell fire. The flag had covered a table during the town memorial because his body had not returned. She placed it in the walnut, she said, not to hide grief, but to keep it from being handled until someone understood that a family's work and a country's wars were carried by ordinary hands. Her final line was practical. Oil the key before winter, or the lock will seize. June cleaned the brass plate, oiled the mechanism, and returned the flag to its sleeve. Ruth's note joined Alden's in the sewing tin, each folded along its own creases. The bronze star had remained wrapped in cloth for more than 2 years. On May 8, 2025, the 80th anniversary of Victory in Europe Day, June carried it to Riverside Cemetery in South Paris. Elias drove. Mrs. Foss brought the county records confirming Thomas Bell's service, and Reverend Boyd read only his name, rank, and dates. There was no ceremony beyond that. June placed the medal beneath the small veteran's marker beside Thomas's family stone, waited while the cemetery caretaker secured it in a weatherproof case, and left one turned maple ball without painted stripes at the base. Of the $23,600, June used 4 coins. The mercury dime had marked her first practice materials. 1 Walking Liberty $50 paid for the final pane of restoration glass after Elias refused to add it to her account. An Indian head cent was set beneath the rebuilt lathe bed as a date marker. The 4th, a Morgan dollar, purchased archival paper, linen thread, and a new tin box. Every bill and remaining coin stayed accounted for. June wrapped the currency in fresh cotton tape and closed the formula booklet only after copying it by hand and returned the cash to the lignum-vitae mallet head. Beside it, she placed a ledger showing every repair, every purchase, and every hour donated by another person. On the cedar disc, she wrote one line, "For the next one." The shop reopened without an announcement. Doris pinned an index card to the cafe corkboard between a notice for snow plowing and a church bean supper. Bell wooden lawn sets made slowly orders by mail. The first order came from a retired teacher in Bethel who wanted 4 striped balls to replace those lost from her father's set. The second came from an innkeeper in Freiburg. By summer, more than 40 names had been written into a mailing ledger. June accepted only as many orders as the wood and weather allowed. Customers waited. Most did not object. Caleb returned in September carrying a pine board beneath one arm. He had grown broader through the shoulders, though his red schwinn remained the same. During the summer he had carved letters into the board, painted them cream, and framed the edges with narrow blue and red stripes. The sign read, "Bell, Sporting Goods and Daughters." June held it against the front wall. "There have not been daughters here for years." Caleb shrugged and looked toward Ruth's tintype in the window. "There are now." Together, they hung the sign beneath the surviving original letters. Caleb drove the left fastener too deep, split the pine, and stood staring at the damage. June handed him the roofing hatchet. "Pull it." He did. They glued the split, moved the fastener half an inch, and seated it with 3 measured strokes. That winter, June began a letter on the archival paper purchased with the Morgan dollar. "My dear one, whoever you are." She wrote her full name, the date she arrived, and the condition of the roof. She recorded which well water test had passed, where the floor remained thin near the stove, and how long the hide glue needed to swell before heating. She described Doris's paper bags, Elias's account book, Harlan's missing fingertip, Caleb's single mitten, and the forward prayer spoken beside the walnuts. She did not write about being rescued. The building had offered no rescue. It had required labor, judgment, and the willingness to stop before a careless repair became permanent. What it gave her was a place where effort remained visible after the person making it had gone. Near the end, she copied the lesson held by the miniature ivory ball and the enormous sealed mallet. In the game of life, many mallet blows will fall. But a strong core rolls forward instead of breaking. She signed the letter, folded it, and placed it inside the new tin box. The box did not go into the mallet head. It remained in the workbench drawer where another hand might find it without special tools. At dusk, June closed the enamel cans and swept the day's maple curls into a basket. Beyond the window, Stony Brook moved beneath a skin of early ice. The chickadees returned to the walnut branches, their small weight scarcely bending them. She rolled the finished blue-striped ball toward the rack and stopped it beneath her palm. The wooden croquet-set maker's shop waits. It has always waited. In the county clerk's office, Evelyn Foss retired with little ceremony and left her desk to a younger woman. Before departing, she removed most personal things, the silver letter opener, 2 photographs, and a cardigan kept for cold mornings. The glass desktop remained. Beneath it lay Samuel Bell's worn dollar bill, his penciled words still visible where the paper had not faded. For the road home,